Hey, Cinelle.
All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to A Measure of Belonging panel. This is the final panel, the final event of the 5th annual Pat Conroy Literary Festival. And we couldn't be happier that this is the event that is happening. We appreciate all your support of the festival. We appreciate those of you who have been tuned in to our various virtual events. We also appreciate your support of the Pat Conroy Literary Center. We have this festival every fall around Pat Conroy's birthday, which is October 26th, the first weekend in November generally. But your year-round support of the Pat Conroy Literary Center is very much appreciated. So here's how the deal is going to go down today. I am going to introduce Cinelle Barnes. Cinelle is the editor of A Measure of Belonging, and she can't be with us, sadly, today. So I'm going to introduce Cinelle, and then Jonathan Haupt is going to play some clips that Cinelle made for us of her talking in general about the book, her giving a brief reading, and then she's going to introduce Latria and Gary. And then they're going to read, and then we're going to talk about some stuff. I'm going to ask them some questions and listen to their responses. So Cinelle Barnes is a memoirist, essayist, and educator from Manila, Philippines, and is the author of Monsoon Mansion, a memoir, and Malaya, Essays on Freedom. And, as I said, she is the editor of A Measure of Belonging, 21 Writers of Color on the New American South. She earned an MFA in creative nonfiction from Converse College. Her writing has appeared in BuzzFeed Reader, Catapult, Literary Hub, Hyphen, Panorama, a journal of intelligent travel, South 85, among others. Her work has received fellowships and grants from VONA, Hundeman, and the John and Susan Bennett Memorial Arts Fund, the Lowcountry Quarterly Arts Grant. Her debut memoir was listed as a best nonfiction book of 2018 by Bustle and nominated for the 2018 Reading Women Nonfiction Award. Barnes was a WILA, Women Writing the American West Award screener, and a 2018-19 Scholastic Art and Writing Awards juror. She was the 2018-19 Writer-in-Residence at the Halsey Institute of Contemporary Art in Charleston, South Carolina, where she and her family live. So now it will take just a moment for Jonathan to patch in.
Hello everyone, I'm Cinelle Barnes, author of Monsoon Mansion and Malaya Essays on Freedom, and the editor of today's featured book, A Measure of Belonging, 21 Writers of Color on the New American South, recently named a New York Times Book Review New and Noteworthy title. This collection challenges the idea of a monolithic Southern culture and celebrates the incredible diversity in the contemporary South, by featuring essays by 21 of the finest young writers of color living and working in the region today, who all address a central question: who is welcome? The idea for this book was conceived a decade ago when I moved to the South from New York City. At a welcome dinner hosted by my husband's new employer, my form of resistance came up against a longtime Charlestonian's form of resistance, as I describe in the introductory essay to the book. I told her that I loved the weather, the beaches, and historic downtown, but the part of me that had pursued a degree in journalism and literature and was determined to practice what I was taught, told her the whole truth. Remembering how insular the city felt and how I stuck out without having to try, I said, but there are definitely things I would change. Honey, nobody asked you to move here, she said. And that was all. She finished her meal, pushed her chair back, slapped her cloth napkin on the table, left, and never spoke to me again in the years that our husbands shared a place of work. It was not that I wanted or needed to be asked to come somewhere or be a part of something. It was that I was told, to my face, at a welcome dinner, by someone who could have been more than a stranger, that I was not, in fact, invited. The dismissal I felt that night would be felt again throughout the decade I've spent in the South. In these 10 years, I have had interactions, been privy to conversations, and encountered institutions, tangible and not, that could have led me to believe what my former employers, friends, relatives, teachers, and mentors told me way back when. There is nothing for you there. You're going to turn right back around. I haven't turned back around. Instead, I've committed myself to making this place as big as it actually is. Because small is so 10 years ago. Small as that woman who called me honey. Small as the South that saves its best smiles, best hay-alls, and best resources to perpetuate a cultural homogeneity. And small are the books about this region that refuse to acknowledge and celebrate the voices and narratives of honey me, honey she, honey he, honey they, and honey you. And no, there is not nothing for me here. And there is not nothing for other people of color, and there is not nothing for readers like you. There is this book, this anthology. There are the established and emerging writers herein who not only have, but share. While their stories and styles differ, perhaps more so than even I anticipated, the truth they share is that, like most in their generation, they never bought into the lie that they did not belong here. This is a collection of stories that say, honey, you come right here and sit up right next to me. It is my honor to share this virtual stage at the 5th annual Pat Conroy Literary Festival with people who, like me, love the written word. It's an absolute comfort to know that the world of arts and letters, at least here in South Carolina, is in the hands of these wonderful, intelligent, insightful, genuine, and good people. And it is my pleasure to introduce them to you tonight. Reading for you tonight are Latria and Gary Jackson. Latria is a journalist, cultural critic, and 5th-generation South Carolina farmer. She's a graduate of Dartmouth College and later earned her MFA in creative nonfiction from the New School in New York City. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, Southern Living, and Garden and Gun. Gary Jackson is the author of the poetry collection Missing You, Metropolis, which received the 2009 Covey Poetry Prize. His poems have appeared in numerous journals, including Callaloo, Tin House, Los Angeles Review of Books, and Crab Orchard Review. He was featured in the 2013 New American Poetry series by the Poetry Society of America, and is the recipient of both a Covey and Breadloaf Fellowship. He is an associate professor at the College of Charleston and is the associate poetry editor at Crazy Horse. Without further ado, reading from A Measure of Belonging, Latria and Gary.
Thank you, Cinelle. So actually, behind the scenes, we decided that we would read Gary first and then Latria. So Gary, if you would regale us with your selection.
Yeah, my pleasure. And everybody can hear me okay, I'm assuming. Yeah, okay. And thank you, Ellen, and Cinelle, who is actually out there, I think, on the panelist side. But yeah, thank you both for your introductions and for inviting me to be part of not just this panel with Latria, but also the Pat Conroy Festival in general, especially this year, right? Given the news we all got yesterday. So my essay is fairly short, so I think I'll be able to read it mostly in its entirety. I might cut a couple paragraphs. There's not much you need to know except for what Cinelle has already mentioned, which is that, I teach at the College of Charleston, and a lot of it kind of revolves around that. So this essay is titled Ain't Misbehaving. Oh, and it opens with Epigraph by Toni Morrison from the Bluest Eye. And fantasy it was, for we were not strong, only aggressive. We were not free, merely licensed. We were not compassionate. We were polite, not good, but well behaved. We walked down King Street, the main downtown strip in Charleston, South Carolina, which is central to everything. The college bars, the cheap eats, the tourist spots, the historic city market, the Battery, Louis Vuitton, everything. I was treating my mom and stepdad, both of whom had helped my wife and I drive a U-Haul from Albuquerque to Charleston to start my new job at the College of Charleston. But having only lived in the city for 3 days, I was still more tourist than native, and in fact, would never be native, according to Charleston standards. I was not from Charleston, nor my family, or my family's family. No surprise then that the three of us would stumble into Juanita Greenberg's Nacho Royale, lured by the promise of cheap tacos and even cheaper beer. It was late July and we were dying to get out of the sweltering heat, so different from the high desert nights I was used to in New Mexico, when even in the summer, after the sun went down, you could cool off by a good 10 degrees. Inside, we took note of the wait staff, a collection of smiling young white women and men, and we compared them to what we glimpsed of the cooks in the kitchen, all of whom were Black and looking steadily down at the grill. Huh, my mother said, already working out a thesis. The food took so long, they comped us a meal. Whether it was a good or bad omen, we couldn't decide. After dinner, we opted to walk around a little more and have another drink somewhere before going home. My stepdad took note of all the bicycles hitched to light posts and scattered bike racks down the streets and near shop fronts, every one of them secured with student-priced $20 chains. Niggas would have stole all these bikes back home, my stepdad said. Shit, I would clean up down here. My mother laughed in agreement, but told him to be quiet since we were walking in public and white folks were thick out tonight, as they are most nights on King Street. Of the few Black folks we saw, most of them were working in a kitchen or behind a counter. I drove around for a while, partly because I didn't know how to hook back onto I-26 to get home, and partly because I wanted to prove my folks wrong. Charleston was just as Black as Dallas, Texas. Not that far north on King Street, near the I-26 entrance ramp, we drove by an apartment complex where a barbecue was in full swing. We saw 30 to 40 Black people chatting and lounging and kids popping wheelies on bikes. We smelled grilled and smoked meat. There they are, my stepdad smiled. You can drop me off here. My mother is an expert at making snap decisions based off relatively limited information that usually work out for the best. See Exhibit A, my father. So I was fully prepared when she later confessed she felt something was off about downtown. They well behaved down here, she said, meaning the South, meaning she couldn't understand how people could just walk under the Confederate flag shadow on the state grounds or walk by statues erected to honor pro-slavery secessionists on their way to school. I argued that just because we weren't stealing every unattended bike in Charleston didn't necessarily mean anything either, but being well behaved wasn't a sign of subservience. But I could see how the idea of being well behaved could be used against someone, against me. It's no secret that my voice carries. My wife and I jokingly call this Black man's voice and joke about how long it took her to get used to it. The same voice I have used all my life. If my mother and I are in the same room, we do in fact shout at each other. So we can continue the conversation while one of us goes into another room to fix something to eat, use the bathroom, turn on the TV, while standing in line to vote in the 2008 midterm election. I heard my name called out from someone standing about 12 people ahead of us in line. A coworker had picked me out after hearing me speak in what I thought was a low tone to my wife. People on the first floor of the English department hear my conferences with students in my fourth floor office. So I'm not surprised when I startle students when I call everyone's attention, when I tell a student this will be on the test, when I laugh out loud, when I yell hello from across campus. Once, a white male student accused me of always yelling, of always being angry. He even wrote in a midterm paper that was supposed to focus on poetic form that he thought I had a darkness inside of me. I responded with concern for his well-being, as we are trained to do as professors who teach students who may be going through myriad issues in school or back home. But I was not about to explain or defend my own literal voice. Later, that same student submitted a poem for workshop in which he described a poetry class murdering their poetry professor and then celebrating. And did I modulate my voice? Try to consciously lower the register to hit right below that indecipherable decibel that made only white people uncomfortable, but no one else? Of course I did. Look up the definition of well-behaved, and there's a picture of an assistant professor trying to make tenure. Though I denied the student a direct apology, I thought back to what my mother said after only being in Charleston for 3 days. They're well-behaved down here. After a poetry reading, I skipped ahead, by the way. After a poetry reading, a well-meaning white woman told me, "It can't be that bad, can it?" I told her it was. "Maybe in Kansas," she said, referencing one of my poems that I had just read. "But here, people don't act like that anymore." I told her that I lived here too, meaning Charleston, and also the world. But she was already off and talking about something else, once again reminding me that I was not from here and not part of her world. Or more accurately, my world was considered invalid. "Just the other day, a black man held the door open for me and my friends," the woman said. I almost told her that black man probably hated her guts and that being polite did not equal forgiveness or grace. Maybe I should have said more, should have tried to explain. Instead, I simply finished my drink, thanked the organizers for putting the reading together, and politely left. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. That was fantastic. Well written, well read. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I'm giving myself a second to just absorb. That is such a hard act to follow. I should have gone first.
I'm sorry.
Everything you said about your voice is true. And now I feel some type of way now that it's my turn to. At least we can laugh about it, but everything you said is true. And everything that was perceived 3 days in, I've been thinking about for a long time. So.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, but hearing you read it, having read it, it's just, thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm with you. Oh, yeah, we're together. I'll shut up now, but take it away.
So some of you all know me, maybe, and some of you don't, but I live in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and my essay is about policy, climate change, and flooding, and sort of being the canary in a coal mine here in Spartanburg and what I decided to do about it. So this is called Nuisance, an essay about home. The water comes while I am asleep, and it is only when I hear my dog barking her high-pitched, "Something is different and I need your attention right now," bark, that I realize we are in trouble. Ice-cold terror hits the pit of my stomach and runs out towards my wrists, making it hard to use my hands, even though I know I only have a few minutes to get moving. This whole thing is my fault, I tell myself. I forgot to check the drains around my home before going to bed. Dealing with the drains used to be my daddy's job, but he died a couple of years ago. My mother had back surgery, so she can't do it, and my little brother lives 3,000 miles away, so I am the keepers of the grounds when I am home. This year, early spring came in early March, It comes earlier every year, and the pollen strings from the giant oak tree in my yard cover everything. Cars, trees, even animals if they stay still long enough. The wind blows the strings to the ground, and they accumulate in the corners of our property, where the drains for our street happen to be. The drains were never meant to receive this much rainfall, and Detrius slows down the water's ability to exit our backyard. The hurricane magnitude downpour that arrives in the middle of the night overwhelms the 1970s engineering of the house. When there is nowhere for the water to go, it invites itself inside. By the time I tug on my Anorakan boots, the bottom floor of my house will be standing in almost a foot of water, many waves licking the first 2 steps in the foyer, wondering if it could find a way to reach the second floor. Part human negligence, part natural catastrophe. My insurance man has a name for what is happening: nuisance flooding. His tone on the other end of the phone when I call him and tell him what has happened implies that I'm the nuisance, that I should have known better, that I am not a good homeowner. He hangs up and I make my way back outside, standing in knee-high water in the pouring rain, pulling pollen strings from the drain cover with my bare hands. Nuisance flooding. Not big enough to warrant structural concern. Not big enough to be a catastrophe to anybody but us. My daddy's side is a farming family that is 5 generations deep, so we see every roadblock as a new thing to get over, but not the thing that could stop us. I wonder what my ancestors would say about the weather now, about all the things I can count that are changing in my world, the way our crops perform, the abundance of hot, sticky nights that didn't used to exist, the lack of lightning bugs at night. 20 years ago, my grandma sent out warnings trying to tell folks that things were changing. She was deemed a nuisance. I think back to what the man from State Farm said. This is my home, and this is my community, and I just can't give up on it. I can't let what I have float away, even if the insurance man will never understand. Life happens on the top floor. That's where all of our bedrooms are, and the kitchen. Things on the ground floor, the stuff I'm feverishly hoisting to higher ground, is what makes life worth living. My dead daddy's vinyl record collection, my brother's art, the thousands of books I have piled to the ceiling, each bookcase from a different chapter of my life. My mama's ambitions live down there, tethered to her sewing machine, her room of dreams, the only thing that remains of her time spent at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City, where she trained to be a fashion designer. When she graduated, her parents pressured her to come back home, where she married my dad, who sought to leave his farming roots far behind. They bumbled their way towards what they thought happily ever after was supposed to look like. They had children, created careers, and eventually bought this house. For my brother and me, this house was a beacon. No matter where we traveled for work, we'd always been able to come back home. If we were coming in late, Mom and Dad would leave the light on. I have had the same house key my entire life, and I am so used to the slip and click sound when I turn the knob that I have a Pavlovian response. As soon as the door opens, my shoulders slump and my muscles relax. I am home. I wonder how long I'll get to feel that way. Things are starting to change. Dad is gone. The water continues to rise. Between 1997, when my parents purchased this house, and 2017, the house has flooded 4 times in total. In the last 365 days, the house has flooded 3 times. We modify, we adjust. We always have. We put everything we care for in plastic bins to keep the damp out. I try to check the drains weekly, but as a traveling journalist, I am on the road 120 days of the year, and that routine sometimes falls to the wayside. Carelessness always creeps in, and we start leaving our things around the way people living in houses do. A favorite book is left on a low-lying table in the den. Piles of sewing patterns Mama was sorting through the night before stacked neatly on the floor. By the time I make it downstairs, these items will be ruined, victims of the rapidly churning cold water that is steadily creeping towards my knees. Every time the rains come, we lose a little more of ourselves. I wonder how much Black history we've lost. First edition books, records from my father's time at an HBCU, my mama's recollections of the Obamas entering the White House. Black history is so fragile that I see anything tangible as valuable, and I'm crushed when I think of all that has been lost to disaster. Floods, fires, and terror. Arms tired and tingling, back hurting from the excess weight I've put on due to overwork and stress. My body wants to leave what I own to the water, but my heart won't let me. This house, this little acre on a map with my mama's name on it, may be the only proof that my family has made it, that the mason's daughter and the farmer's son could come together and buy a 2-story standalone home in a large subdivision on Spartanburg's west side. Proof of middle-class Black American existence. For me, this house isn't a status symbol, but rather a reminder of what's possible now. This address gives me some stability. Because this place exists, I can be a full-time writer. This address also gives me the ability to vote, and I exercise that right every chance I get. The land around here is imbued with voting rights history that I refuse to just let die. 5 miles away from here, when emancipated slaves went to go vote for the first time, they were terrorized. Some were whipped. Others watched as the ears were cut off of their loved ones. Hooded men burned down their houses. Later, in the 1940s, up near the northern part of the county line, an African-American woman named Lottie Pope Gaffney tried to exercise her right to vote. She too lost everything. I know I can vote from anywhere, but something about voting here seems too important to lose. Cast-off pages of my first draft of a story float past me, the pages clumping together, my editing marks now illegible, smeared ink. Last night, before all of this, I was writing about Princeville, North Carolina. Founded by emancipated slaves, it is the oldest incorporated African-American town in the country, and it has been wiped off the map twice by floods. After Hurricane Matthew ripped through the town in 2016, the residents were given 3 options: rebuild everything all over again, hoping the new structures could stand the floods. It's a given that there will be more floods. 2, pick up the entire town and move it all farther from the river. Or 3, accept a buyout from the federal government and move somewhere else, abandoning Princeville altogether. For 2 years, I have gone back and forth to this little town, sitting in on city council meetings, wondering what the end was going to be, what the residents would choose. If the dam near the town was raised any higher, it would flood the mostly white established town of Tarboro. So the government keeps building the dam back the same way with small modifications. The officials over infrastructure won't return my calls about the dam, and I'm pretty sure after 10 voicemails left weekly, I am deemed a nuisance. the nosy reporter who wants to know what will happen to history, who can't just let things be, who doesn't realize that the North Carolina establishment likes the old way just fine. My draft doesn't have an ending, so before bed, I toss the sheets aside for recycling. I didn't expect them to be carried back to me on the water. I have made my career by crafting stories that highlight the resilience of people living in tense places. A football game after police protests in Charlotte, North Carolina, large powwows near Standing Rock, North Dakota, a roller derby rink in Flint, Michigan. I collect these stories and figure out what they have to say about our country and all the ways in which we are failing our citizens. I write them because I want readers to see all of the ways we can be better, to see opportunities to help each other. I haven't turned in the Princeville story because I haven't figured out how to sum up what Princeville's trials say about America. I wonder what this Gordian knot says about me. I can't save my own house. What makes me believe I can save a whole town? I don't have the money to stop my drain problem. Contractors say they believe French drains may save our overtaxed established ones, but that's a $5,000 science experiment. My mind tells me that if I had that much money to spare, it might be better to just clean up the place and put the damn thing on the market. In the end, this is how we'll be moved. Barely surviving disaster after disaster until they break our resilience, until we can no longer adapt. And this house and my soul are just a shell. I realize I'm battling so much more than just water. The ever-encroaching threat of poverty, my mother's illness, my own depression and sense of fatalism. I want something better for Princeville. I hope they get it. I want to write a better ending. Eventually, it stops raining. I'll lose a day's pay sifting through the remnants of our things, seeing what I can save. We'll go back to being careful for as long as we can remember to be, even though our old habits will return eventually. I think carefully, analytically, about how I can keep this from happening again. I turn on the television and see other people battling this type of low-stakes flooding. At that moment, I am an indicator of other people's suffering. That, I think, I can do something about. I start making phone calls to local officials. Hi, my name is Latria Graham, and I live in Spartanburg County. Let's just say that I'll be your new nuisance. Thank you.
Great ending.
Yeah.
That was beautiful, powerful, a wonderful arc, and to send us on home with that good smile after so much. Thank you both for those excellent readings. A measure of belonging. Who belongs? Who is welcome? That is the question that underlies the 21 essays that you guys created for this collection. So let's talk about this. This was not a planned question, but I sit here on this day and I look at the three vignettes of us across this screen and I see me. And I say, do you belong here? Are you welcome here? And I answer myself, well, sure you do, Ellen. What you hear, what you have read in this book, what you have heard from these writers, you entirely honor, you celebrate, you believe, your thoughts are their thoughts. And yet I see that face, and I know that I would be one of those white women on King Street, right? I mean, that's who I am. Do I have a place at this table where we sit now? And if I do, Why? How do we determine? That is kind of what lies behind the whole creation that you guys have done. How do we determine who belongs?
Gary, do you want to take this one or shall I? Because it's such a big question.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, I don't know if you have a response.
I don't know. Like, you know, I know one of the questions that we got, like one of our pre-game questions or whatever, had us thinking about the anthology in general, and something about how did it feel to be invited to be part of it. So I guess I could kind of like tweak the answer I kind of had for that to kind of address, Ellen, what your question is about, like, you know, how do we determine who belongs and why do we belong? I will say this though, like, the difference between the white women on King Street and me is that they have always felt free in that world, I guess, right? And one of the things I think this anthology allows us to do, and by us, I'm talking about, you know, Latria, myself, Cinelle, everybody in it, is that it gives us a sense of freedom. Not even a sense, but it gives us freedom too to write these stories. And freedom is worth a lot in this world, as much as it's worth in terms of when we think about freedom in the abstract and simply just being free. But like freeing to write about our lives as we live them, and have people read these stories and essays, right? Like Ellen and anybody who's listening or watching. And so, I mean, in the end, we should all be free to belong here. And I feel like anything we can do to kind of open those gates is worth it. And, you know, and I will say my mother does read my stuff sometimes, which is fun. I don't think she's read this essay yet, and I'm sure my stepdad has it. But you know, and for a reader, if you read these stories, then my hope is that you get some sense of freedom where you can read these stories and you can say, like, I could write those stories, I can read them, I belong in these spaces, and I can walk down King Street and say whatever the fuck I want, and and I belong here just as much as anyone else, regardless if you're a native or tourist. And in some ways, I mean, I can only speak to the tourist aspect. And so, Latria, I'm sure you could speak more because you have family that's been here for generations, and I know that's not the same, you know.
Yeah.
So I'll shut up and pass the mic to you.
It's fine. So I've been, you're right in a lot of ways, and sort of this idea of thinking about who belongs. Something that like I think is so interesting is like this sense of ownership or feeling of ownership, like that we have over something. And I've been thinking about this more with the idea of the outdoors and indigenous lands, and the idea that like this was somebody else's home before we were on it. So I think very much about the South that way too. There were people here before we were here. What makes us think we own this, or we own this tradition, we own this history or this sensibility in that way, right? Because that's what makes you feel like you need to belong, right? Like that's the thing that's putting up sort of this gate and this moment that you're having. And people are always thinking about authenticity, right? As if the South is not capable of change, right? As if like it's not always evolving. And that's something that really frustrates me in a lot of ways. One, like having this sort of historical base here forever. And they're like, well, we've always done this way, but I was like, we can do it differently. Like in having family here and being very, very staunch Southern Baptist, having hand tattoos and blue hair is like not a thing where I'm from, but like it is part of the New South now because I make it so, right? So it's one of those things that like, we're obviously writing it back against the notion of who belongs here, and we're trying to change the frame on this, right? In our own way as being part of this. So like, that's what I'm thinking about it, is like, why are we doing the us versus them thing all the time anyway. Like if you're interested in understanding how things came about and understanding the history and having some respect for it, why can't we just start there? Why can that not be the baseline about who is willing to be in this space and engage in this space and recreate responsibly and be a tourist to this place? Because when I think about Charleston, there are a lot of people that love living their Gone with the Wind fantasies with the big hats and all, like the whole thing, right? Not understanding that some of these plantations had a 90% mortality rate, right? Depending on the lives of enslaved people that were there. So they're only getting half of it. They're only getting the fantasy. And I think that's a bigger problem we have with this country that we may get to in a later question. But, you know, something that I really, in deciding to be part of this, one, like everybody in it that I knew of was phenomenal. And I was very excited about that part of it. But writing something like that, hoping that people will understand what's at risk for all of us and understanding our perspective. Reading can give people empathy. It can widen their worlds. You know, it can make people accept us as Americans too. And I've said that to people before and they're like, what are you talking about? Of course you're American. I was like, you all always hyphenate it. Some of these things, like family and home, like there's always, like, I'm always fighting that. And a lot of hate mail that I get from mostly older white dudes, they're like, I'm the true American. I'm the true Southerner. And I was like, the Grahams started selling slaves in 1788. Do you really want to do this math with me? You know, if we want to talk about the idea of original and like, it gets very sticky, I think. And so opening up this definition to make sure that people understand why things were the way they were and moving towards something newer, something different, something interesting, hopefully is something that I think a lot of us tried to capture in this, right? The frustrations and joys and challenges of that, because there's a whole lot of that, but it all comes, at least for me, mostly out of policy, right? Who does the zoning, who decides how tall the dam gets built and all of that, and where those things lead back to. And in most places, it has to do with race and segregation. So, long-winded answer, sorry.
No, that was great.
That was great.
I got nothing. Yeah.
You guys both punted just a little bit on my direct question of, does Whitey here belong in this conversation with you guys on this day? But I'm gonna
I'll add to that. You have to, if we want something to be really interesting and authentic, and I'll just say this as a DEI organizer, like sometimes only white people can get white people. Like they're not going to listen to me regardless, right? Or they're not in my friend group. So I think I tried to answer it the best that I could, but you do belong here if you're willing to, and I think you are, having known, you know, I know we do not know one another that well, but if you're willing to do the work and understand why things are the way they are in history. So I tried to make it broader, but yes, I think you do, because that's the only way that certain things are going to change. It's going to take an intersectional, multi-ethnic conversation for that to happen. So you have to be part of this, because if it was all up to Black people, did you see how they voted this week? We would have changed it. Like some things would be different, you know, just to, I'm just gonna, you know, so it does, and that's not meant to get political, but it means we're only part of the equation.
Yeah.
Well, let's do segue into that. Let's take that question of what it means to you to be a contributor to this anthology, not just today in general, but like today, after our news yesterday. What does it mean to you, for you, to have a voice in this collection of pieces on this day? Yeah. Either one.
Yeah.
Latria, you have a...
Well, I mean, I really hope it helps people understand the South. Something that I get frustrated about, and sort of, I feel like tweeting is like sending your voice out into an empty room, but I do it sometimes anyway, because I'm like, this is some ish I want y'all to understand when you're ready to rag on the South about the way this election went, right? And so I put this thread up of, spending 4 hours in line around maskless people in order to cast a vote, right? So that they understand the type of voter suppression. It has nothing to do with even my background, right? Being an Ivy League graduate, being all of these other credentialed things, I still have to get in line to cast my vote. And this is what it took. And these are some of the other voter suppression. As some of y'all know, I think South Carolina changed the date for early voting. And as a travel journalist, I was going to go in on day one, September 28th. I usually take my elders with me. I make sure people need rides, that sort of jam and all that stuff. And they changed it by a week and I couldn't cast my vote then. I couldn't take these other people to do, what needed doing and all of that sort of stuff. And now it was a mixture of trying to figure out how I was scrambling, just like the rest of the South was scrambling to try to figure out, or at least the rest of South Carolina, scrambling, in order to try to figure out what that looked like and what that meant. And yeah, anytime, like whenever it was, her name is Gretchen, I'm blanking on the name of the governor of Michigan, when one journalist tweeted out, they were like, of course there's a Confederate flag in his yard and he's been radicalized by poverty. And I was like, y'all just go for the simple story every time. Every time. This man has $130,000 worth of automobiles in his yard. Like it's so much. Poverty does not equal Confederacy equals. It's so much more insidious and well-rounded and genteel than that. And people don't necessarily see those parts of it. So it's one of those things that, like, I don't have to. Being in this book makes me feel like I'm not writing back against these very snap judgments of the South by myself. It is being done beautifully, it's being done with nuance, it is being done from different states. And that's incredibly important and powerful to me because my career came about pretty much tracing sort of the rise of the current president. So I've been doing this job for 5 years. And I've been writing about racial terror and hard things for 5 years. And it very much feels like, and I think all of you know this as writers and as craft people, you are in the dark by yourself, hoping that what you're writing makes sense to somebody else at the end of the line, but it is very much a lonely endeavor, right? And then this book comes out and you realize there are 20 other people in it that also did this lonely endeavor, that also believe the region that you live in and love in and the people that you welcome to this place believe it is worth engaging with and having conversations about. And that's something that I've been fighting for ever since I left and went to college, right? So that's been a 20-year battle. So there's never been anything like this. I've been searching for this forever, and I'm just so grateful to be a part of it.
Yeah, ditto. but and I'll just say a little bit more, but yeah, I mean, just speaking as a writer too, and I'm probably not the best person to ask in terms of like how it feels today, like right after, like post-election, because it takes me years to write about things, and I'm so cynical at heart that I'm not gonna try to divine too much yet, if that makes sense, about what this moment means. Because for me, it takes years to really figure that out. But that's just me. But I will say this year, 2020, and how this book kind of came about in the middle of everything that's been going on, in terms of, the election, police brutality, murder of George Floyd, and this frustrating trend. And I might get in trouble for even saying this, but I've noticed how so many journals and magazines have reached out to friends of mine who are writers of color, and they want us to write about police brutality and the murder of Black men and women. And a lot of writers that I know have pushed back on that. And, in the sense that you solicit us because you want us to write about trauma and you want us to write about suffering. And we don't just write about those things. And the expectation shouldn't be that when another Black woman or a Black man gets murdered, that you need us to write a piece for you to help make sense of it. And I mean, the you know, could just be white American general, but really really it's, you know, whoever the editor is, or whatever that particular readership is. And so in contrast to that, you know, like when Cinelle came to all of us, I'm sure, but when she came to me and was just like, hey, Gary, you want to just write something about living in Charleston these past 7 years? You know, I got an idea. I mean, and that goes back to my earlier answer about how freeing that is and how rare that is, which is unfortunate in the sense that people don't just come up and ask us, you know, just write about your life, like write about whatever you want, you know. During the pandemic, Journal asked me to write about music, and this was like in July. You have no idea how excited I was like, oh shit, you want me to write about music? I don't have to write about COVID or, you know, or whatever it is. They're like, yeah, just write something. So I ended up writing something about like Donna Summer and Grace Jones. And you know, because I'm Black, you know, race is always a lens. But I guess my point is, like, books like this is really freeing in the sense that as writers of color, we get to write whatever story we want to write about the landscapes that we live in. And they are American landscapes, and what we write is American literature. And that goes back to what Latria was saying, like, not African American literature, American literature. You know, it's both. And this idea that you know, books like this should be able to reach and be read by everybody. And I think that goes back to Ellen, what you were saying earlier. And like, we don't write these books for other people of color to read as a, you know, exclusively, right? Like we know this shit. We write it so other people can read it as well. And I mean, we're trying to reach multiple audiences, right? And I mean, and yeah, I don't know what else to say, but just, yeah, it's just really freeing and humbling. And I'm so appreciative that we all had the chance to write these stories without having some directive to write about, to exploit ourselves, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that the multiplicity of potential readerships, I think, is one of the great things about a collection like this. Latria made a reference briefly to, you know, this being the kind of thing you look to read. I've heard Cinelle talk about how she, as a young child in the Philippines, wished that she had had a text like this to read, you know, so that beautiful multiplicity of potential target audiences, the people, these kids who have people like you to read about and learn and grow from, and people of all sorts of skin tones and mindsets, some of which might change, right, in reading something like this. So what then are the conversations that you would hope might come about in your communities, in your neighborhoods, in your bigger friend groups, in your workplaces at the College of Charleston? What would be some of your hopes that a book like this might inspire a way of conversation?
Latria, you want me to?
Either one. Whoever.
I mean, I just to mix it up, I could say a few things first,
Yeah.
so that I'll pass it. You know, like, I was thinking about my students for one thing, because you know, I'm always thinking about my students, which is both good and bad. But you know, like, this book is great for an intro class, and that is a good thing. Like, I don't mean, that is not a derogatory statement, but I love teaching anthologies like this because it really opens up the potential and possibilities of what someone can write about. And like, Ellen, what you had said earlier about how, or what Cinelle had said about how she wishes she had a book like this when she was young, you know, just starting to write. And for like burgeoning writers, I feel like books like this are just invaluable, because so often, and now I'll speak directly of my own experience teaching at the College of Charleston, in my community of academics and students, you know, like we'll read Lucille Clifton or Audre Lorde, or, you know, contemporary poets like Natalie Diaz or Terrence Hayes. And students are like, I didn't know poets wrote about meth addiction or poverty or police brutality in like 1978, you know, and it's like, yeah, this has been around for a while, you know, and for the history of this country. And like you introduce students to these texts and they suddenly realize that what they learned as traditional canon isn't the end all be all, right? And so I feel like it opens up not just dialogue and conversations about what one can write about, but it also frees them in their thinking of, or it frees them in their kind of limited understanding of like, my poems have to sound like Shakespeare. And I know it's kind of a cliche, but even this semester, I got like a poem with some these and thous, and it's like, you don't have to do that in your poetry, you know, like, you know, use your voice, you know, write how you talk to the people in your community. Like that's as poetic as anything else. But in terms of like academics and colleagues, you know, at the College of Charleston, it's always good when, you know, we have, I don't even know what to call them, but not symposiums, but we share our work with each other. And, you know, and we forget because we're all in our silos in academia, right? Where, you know, over here, I'm focusing on poetry, over here I'm focusing on medieval studies, over here I'm focusing on this, and none of us really know what the other's researching or talking about. And you know, like a book like this, or pieces like this that I've written or contributed, and if I teach it or show other people, colleagues, like I was thinking about Latria's, which you wrote about Princeville, and how similar things happening here in the Phillips community, which is a historic Black community. And here it's a highway that they're trying to build that will just go through the community, which you probably know more about than I do even. And how I wouldn't have even connected those dots between those two communities, right? Unless I, you know, until I read your piece. And the same thing with my colleagues, you know, they're like, oh, well, maybe we could do some interdisciplinary work, or, you know, or introduce these texts to my students or whatever it may be. But, and so I don't know, I feel like these books are essential to opening up our understanding of one another's work and also deepening our empathy, which is something, Latria, you had said earlier, which is everything, especially now.
It really, really is. Like empathy and compassion are what makes the world run, like ethically run, I think, when we have it. Sometimes we don't. I've been thinking a lot about that question because my community is very fluid in some ways. Like as a freelance journalist, like I have 40 bosses a year, and I have like homies that I occasionally exchange work with, but like there's nowhere that I go, like an institution like the College of Charleston, to sort of think about community in that very sort of hard sense. So I have to think about what I hope editors will get from this sometimes. And sometimes I just hope that they get interest in the South. Obviously, you have beautifully put together magazines like Southern Living and Garden and Gun, and I write those for them. But often places like the Washington Post, which I think is going to try to change this, what we call parachute journalism. We're going to fly somebody in for 4 days, and they're going to like capture all they can and like hope that these scenes tell us something about America, and they're out, right? It's not someone from a community. Something that I say whenever I put together a magazine or I'm in a book like this, I'm like, hire these people. They know how to write beautiful lyrical sentences, and they understand this place in a way that someone parachuting in for a couple of hours cannot do, right? Like they're going to be able to approach conversations like, and I'll never forget it. I was working on my master's thesis in Eatonville, and I was working on a Zora Neale Hurston piece in Eatonville, and like this older Black guy that ran a fish market wouldn't talk to me. But my dad was with me, and he starts talking to him about something. And next thing you know, 2.5 hours later, like they're still sitting there talking. I finished my fish sandwich. I have what I need, and they're still like having the time. It's the way that you learn to talk to people and engage with people in a very different way when you spent time in a spot. And then something else that like really made me very jealous, but made me very proud is the lyricism of this book. Like some of those sentences in there, I'm like, damn, I wish I had written that. Like, you know, that's like, I rarely ever get literature envy. Like I will call it that because I really do think, and I still think that I have my own lane, but there are some moments where I'm like, ooh, how did they do that, right? And I pull that paragraph and I start sort of unwinding some of that. But to speak to what Gary said, I think it expands the canon in a way that people can pick up and say, here's a book. Because something that I don't teach that often, but when I do, I sort of teach and refer to or try to books from the South. And University of South Carolina has a Grit Lit book. And whenever I started trying to write about the South and looking for anthologies about the South, I use that, and it's brutal and it's about poverty and the idea that you will never tell anybody you are cold and everybody's white, right? I love Rick Bragg. Same thing. Everybody's white. He's the reason I probably started as a sports writer, but I understand the way whiteness functions in his world, and that like I'm always forcing myself to, my body always has to be forced into the shoes of these people, but no one ever has to be in mine. And there's just also the power that this is a book, and there's nothing against magazines. I make my living in magazines. But like this printed thing that you can get from a library in a way, it just stands the test of time differently than a magazine. And I'm hopeful that it'll be in print. Of course, we always want it to be in print forever, but like, I hope that people get it, that they really understand what this is doing, what all the writers in this are doing, because everybody's brilliant. Everybody is so smart. You know, this roster is incredible. And I'm not even talking about like, I'm grateful to be on it, but even if I wasn't in it, I'm like, this is something that you need. That's why the New York Times picked it up. That's why the Garden Gun has a full page on it and stuff, is because it's essential in understanding how to engage with this region, particularly, and I forgot about this, Black South Carolinians chose Biden, right? And, you know, that ended up sort of being the elect. And Abrams helped flip Georgia. Abrams and all of the Black organizers helped flip that. So like, this is a region that this country is not going to be able to do without, and not going to be able to continue writing off. So you might as well figure out how to understand us and change this place with us, because we've been pushing this rock up a hill for a long time. I'm only 34, and this rock has been around as long as I've been around, right? So I'll stop talking now, but it's a big deal.
Thank you, sister.
Yeah.
All right. Well, believe it or not, we have been at this for an hour. We are getting near the end, but I want to ask you one last thing. The next thing that you would love to work on, right?
Uh-oh.
Yeah. What is like the dream thing? Like maybe Latria, you know, whoever commissions you to do the next thing, forget logistics and finances and all the rest of that. What's the next thing you want to be or would love to be working on? Maybe
I know my answer, but
I feel like right now I'm working on two things that are dream things that like are giving me, I'm grateful for them. They're giving me weird vibes and I love it, which is such an odd thing to say. But this election cycle, I went to Florida to write about the Ocoee Massacre. And so for those that don't know, on November 2nd, 1920, this Black man, a prosperous Black man who owned several orange groves named Julius July Perry, who is from South Carolina. He's from Travelers Rest. You know, he moved to Florida and he had land and he was able to go vote. And he did that. And in the end, a mob comes to sort of terrorize him and they burn the town, the Black side of the town of Ocoee, and they kill somewhere between 4 and 125 people. We will never know how many. It becomes a sundown town. There are no Black people in it anymore. And I got to spend this past week in Ocoee covering the election, doing some of the research for Julius July Perry. And 100 years ago, when they lynched him, after he went to go vote, 100 years ago, he didn't get his burial rights. Yesterday, he was being given his last rites when they called the election for Biden-Harris. So it has been one of those stories where the circle, it's just been kind of unbelievable, almost like supernatural. And as a journalist, you're not supposed to believe in those things, right? But just sort of spending time at his graveside this week, spending time where his house was this week, I'm finally at a point where I don't have to sleep in my truck to tell stories. And that's something that I did because people weren't paying expenses and stuff like that. But people are seeing the stories that I'm working on now as having great value. And, they're sending me where I need to go to tell the stories that America needs to know. And so in some ways, I feel like I'm living the dream. Like, I wish the checks came quicker, but like, that's always the deal. And then the other thing that I'm doing is I'm working on a book proposal about sort of my time, how home and the idea of home, like water rights and things like that, fueled my reporting in Flint and fueled my reporting in Standing Rock, North Dakota, and sort of what it's like to tend my backyard now, sort of in thinking about environmental policy and human rights.
Man, yeah, I can't. That's hard to follow.
Yeah, when you were like, it's gonna take me years to like think about what happened this week, I was like, oh, this deadline is Tuesday. This should be out by the end of the week. Sort of.
You're like, I got shit to do.
No, that's the nature of the job.
Yeah, no, I get it. And where's Ocoee again? Like, I've like.
It's Ocoee, Ocoee. It's right above Orlando. It's Orange County, just like Disney World. Okay. So it is literally the same county.
I'm gonna have to look that up too. That's one of the benefits of this too. Like what we were saying earlier. Like I learned so much just from being in this book and talking, to other contributors.
Exactly.
So Ellen, I don't know. So was your question what is our dream project that we're working on or want to work on now, or just?
Yeah, like if you never mind everything else, what would you love, and perhaps you already doing it, what would you love to be working on right now?
I mean, I'm working currently on I've just finished my second book, and that's poems, and I read from that book yesterday during our poetry reading,
Yeah.
And that's all family stuff, and a lot of my poems over the last 10 years really have dealt with kind of family and kind of autobiography. So I'm kind of ready to go back into fantasy. I'm kind of done with reality for a little bit. My first book incorporates a lot of superheroes. So I'm kind of going back in that direction. And these are all characters of my own creation. And so I'm not writing about Spider-Man and things like that. Even though I love them. But so that's kind of what I'm working on now. And the only reason I can say kind of is because I'm still in this weird liminal place where the work looks like poems, but also like prose. So I even have two separate files that are kind of the same trajectory, but one is prose and one is poetry. And they're very different. And I don't know what the hell I'm going to do with that. But, and that goes back to me being a slow writer. I've been working on this idea forever, and they're mainly African-American superheroes, and superheroes of color. And so I'm really excited about it, but I don't know. I have no idea. Some of the poems have been picked up, so I think you can find some of them out in the world. But if it was dream project, I would just love to just write X-Men. I would turn that motherfucker out, I think, if I had the chance. I've wrote one comic, and it was really fun, and I just love that world, and one of the things I love about comic books now especially is how much they reflect the reality that we live in. And so even though I say I want to play with fantasy, the appeal for me is that fantasy has always been allegorical for the time that we live in. And so I think it would just be really fun to play in that sandbox. I think I was fortunate to see Ta-Nehisi Coates came and spoke at the College of Charleston like a few years back, and this wasn't too long after he started writing for Black Panther. And I think he's still writing Black Panther and Captain America now, even, which is really like if anyone's interested in comics, you should read Ta-Nehisi Coates' take on Captain America. Like he is writing like the flagship title, and it's really interesting. He said in an interview something along the lines of he wanted to kind of basically write the whitest superhero to kind of reconcile his own views with the views of someone like Steve Rogers, because he felt like it would be really nuanced and it would kind of challenge both him and the character. It's really interesting. But anyway, he said at this talk like he loved writing Black Panther because it was like you get to play with toys, basically. You get to like just play with all these toys and like kind of see what works and what they do and like wind them up and let them play in the world and figure out ways that you can get that world to kind of reflect, you know, your own political or, you know, views and reflect the world and make it matter. But also you have the responsibility to tell a fun story. And he was saying for him, that was maybe not a new thing, but a different way of writing, right, than what he had been doing before that, you know. And so I think that would just be so much fun to just totally take on like a superhero comic and see what kind of fun you could have. So yeah, that's it.
I know what I think would be fun, and that would be for us to continue this chat for a while. I've got so many more things I would love to ask you guys, but we're going to have to cut it off. So I'm going to say thank you. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for your talent, both of you. And thank you for sharing your many talents with all of us here today and all of the folks who will be listening to this recording later who weren't able to join us. So everyone who did, thank you. Thank you again for your support. And we'll be seeing you next year for the 6th annual Pat Conroy Literary Festival. In the meanwhile, get out there and read this book, A Measure of Belonging, and all the books of festival participants, and all the books you can get your hands on, period. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.